If we are going to then move on to the Reformation, or I think it's more accurate, don't you think, to say there's Reformations. There's different ones over different times, and the German one is very different to the English one, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And say different thinkers, like say Luther and Thomas More, let's say.
Yeah.
Very different. They weren't of one mind. They didn't agree on everything at all. Or I think it's interesting that someone like, say, Erasmus and Thomas More were very close. There's lots of letters that survive between them.
Yeah.
And they agreed on lots of things, but fundamentally disagreed on others.
Yeah.
But just before we get to that, I did want to ask you briefly, the small amount of correspondence we've had before this interview, I mentioned John Wycliffe and the Lollards, and you said that you thought the emphasis on them is exaggerated in sort of popular history.
Yeah.
I just would love you to expand on that. What you think?
Because it's always a major focus, and actually, if you look into the history of the Lollards, there were very few of them. And they made very little impact. But historically, people write about them as if they were this great reforming movement and they had a massive sway on where the church is today. But I don't think they do. In fact, I think the Oxford movement had a much bigger impact on the church as it stands today than the Lollards.
Right. Okay. Just to mention for people who might not know, John Wycliffe, not to be confused with Wycliffe Jean, very different people. He's a very, very, very early critic of Catholicism. I mean, what is it? The late 14th century, so the late 1300s. So generations before Luther.
Yeah.
And he did say, even though his movement was very small in terms of numbers and things, just cast shadow over the idea of indulgences and the very structure of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Because some people, I think a lot of people think that Luther sort of came out of nowhere.
No.
But that's not the case, is it? I mean, even by the time he hammers up his problems at Wittenberg, there's already a tradition of people doing things like that, isn't there?
Yeah, well, this is it. Like you said, there was Reformations rather than a Reformation. I think it's just the Reformation lasted a lot longer than people think it did. And it was a call for the church to fix itself, to sort its act out, to clear the swamp. And the church refused. Of course, there was the Council of Trent, but that happened pretty much after the Reformation. And if they'd have done that before, maybe they wouldn't have been a Reformation to begin with. But it comes from a lot of different angles. You mentioned the Lollards, that's one of them. But I think our jurisdiction and the king having ultimate jurisdiction in this country is another one. So we had, who was the Pope that deposed King John? Innocent III appointed, you mentioned earlier, he appointed Philip of France to claim England. Again, so we had William the Conqueror, we had Philip of France on the Pope's authority to disrupt our country or claim our country for the Pope, part of the Pope's empire. And I do think it was an empire at that stage, and that's an obvious corruption because the faith is supposed to be, a religion. It's not supposed to be a political entity. But what happened with our King John is he took a knee to the Pope. He capitulated. And that's a great shame because the English people did not like that. It was only when Edward III came along and said, actually, no one has the authority to subject the English people without their consent. We've always been democratic in that way, even when we had an absolute monarchy, which is why we've probably evolved into a constitutional monarchy, because we've recognised our sovereignty as important.
You mentioned John there, our King John.
Yeah.
And he was saying bend the knee. I think eventually, because he was actually excommunicated at one point, he really refused to bend the knee. But in the end, I think for really political reasons, I don't think John was a very spiritual person. I think he was very, very interested in power in this world, and it was just pragmatic. What he needed to do at any given moment, he would do, and I don't think he really cared about his soul and things like that. No. But you mean, just to go ever so slightly on from there, back from there, the idea of conflict between sort of secular power and sort of the papal diadem, normal crowns, the crowns of kings, and papal crowns, that you've got Henry II and Thomas Becket. Obviously, right there is sort of a distilled down version of who is ultimately the higher, or who's closer to God, really. There's an interesting story of when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, and that's much earlier, isn't it? That's sort of the 9th century. And so all that wasn't entirely resolved for hundreds of years, was it?
There's two parts to that. So on the one hand, the king's divine right to rule comes directly from God, not from the Pope. But the other hand, where people often forget, and this is very much in our Englishness, in our Anglican expression of church, is that a bishop's authority comes directly from Christ too. That's handed down from the apostles. That's handed down through each generation of bishops. A bishop's independent authority does not come from the Pope. And the Pope is supposed to be, at least, the first amongst equals, just as the Archbishop of Canterbury is. They're not a leader of the church. They are the first among equals. And we've forgotten a lot of that. And, obviously papal infallibility came in and all of these ridiculous rules that gave the Pope a lot of authority that he shouldn't have had. Right. And that drove a lot of this. But we also it's not just about power, it's also about money. So for a good 700 years, we were paying Peter's pence, taxes to Rome from England just for the sake of ministry. Tithings and money was going over to the continent. And Edward III, again, he was the first person to say, actually, no, we're going to stop this. We are not going to pay taxes to another country. Taxes go to our country. The British taxpayers pay to the British government, and that gets spent in this country. And I think that's quite right too, which is why I think there's a lot of parallels between the Reformation period and Brexit, because it is about jurisdiction. But bringing us to the indulgences, so obviously it wasn't just power and money, it was also about faith. And the problem with indulgences is that one of the reasons they were brought into the church is to pay for St. Peter's in Rome, to build this one of the most beautiful churches in the world. However, it would have cost a lot too. But in order to get people to pay indulgences, this idea of purgatory was created. But up until then, Christianity is based on the idea that Christ died for our sins so that we can have eternal life in him. But purgatory breaks down that message and says, actually, before you get to judgment, you're going to spend some time burning. And if you want some time off that burning, which is going to be suffering similar to hell, if you want some time off of that, you can pay indulgences. You can pay physical money, tangible goods, to get time off your soul being purified. Now, that's not rooted in Scripture. That's not rooted in the faith. That is made up for the purposes of money and power. And so a lot of that, this is why so many people over here were crying out against indulgences, saying this is not Christian, this is incorrect teaching, this is error. And we pushed back. And I think, what was it, 1477, Pope Sixtus IV said that indulgences save souls from pain in purgatory. And I think our answer to that is no, only Christ saves souls, and he already has done. He's paid that price, so we are free. And that argument is, penal substitution is obviously very Anglican.
And the whole concept of purgatory was rejected by them, the very concept of it. I mean, here we're now talking about sort of the higher Renaissance popes, some of the most corrupt men in history. Yeah. And I think that they just, where you described the Pope as sort of the first among equals and that sort of thing, they would describe it more like they're Christ's representative on earth, and they are certainly above everyone else. And even the cardinals are like princes of the church. Yeah. They get described that way, don't they?
Well, they had these massive empires to run, didn't they? They had armies and they had literal countries to run and land, and everyone subjugated themselves to them. And that's why it was so corrupt. And that's why we had like 3 or 4 popes at any given time, because they were fighting amongst themselves for who was the true king.
Yeah, they were anti-popes.
They forgot there's only one king.
There's the Council of Constance in sort of during the age of Henry V, so like the very early 1400s. I think there were sort of 4 popes at that moment, 4 different men running around Europe, all claiming to be the legit pope. I
love that period, and I think the Renaissance period is the peak of Western civilization. It was great, and the Medici family and all of that era, when they were patrons of the arts and actually they were true conservatives, like protecting culture and making culture thrive and making sure there was some beauty and transcendence for normal people to be a part of, and it helped them in their worship. But also there was the corrupt side of that, in that those same patrons were the people that were funding the popes and protecting the popes and helping the popes go to war with each other and with other people.
Well, by that point, I think can we start talking about, we'll go back to the specifically English Reformation, but by that point in Italy, sort of by the early 16th century, you really have sort of a counter-Reformation in full swing by that point, really, don't you? So where the dissidents of Germany, should we say, the Rome's response to that was, well, okay, we're going to be even more Catholic then. If you're going to reject things about Mary, well, we're going to put more emphasis on her. You're going to reject popes, and you're going to reject saints and things like that. Well, we'll put more emphasis on them then.
Yeah, it's funny that nothing's changed really. Germany are still the dissenters. They're still the ones trying to liberalize the church, and Rome is still saying, no, the answer is to put our thumb down on you, that the conversation doesn't actually evolve over hundreds of years, which I find fascinating.
Yeah.
But over here, the problem was that we'd obviously had that. We started with Kent and Northumbria coming together and creating one English church, but we still had different loyalties. So the monks were becoming independent of the English church because the monks were loyal to Rome. And what was happening was they were at conflict or in conflict with the parish system, the parochial system, and monks within their monasteries shouldn't have had permission to administer the sacraments to the public. They shouldn't have been taking confession, or they shouldn't have been administering Holy Communion to the parishioners, but they were. And they weren't answerable to the Archbishop of Canterbury or their local bishops. They were answerable directly to Rome, which is why, part of the reason why we ended up destroying the monasteries. Of course, there were always good intentions, but it often leads to evil. And what we saw was something that was supposed to be for the good of the church ended up being for the goods of the church. And when Henry VIII plundered the monasteries, he destroyed not only the authority of Rome, but he destroyed the actual monasteries themselves. And that's a great shame and a great loss to us and our heritage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I kind of despise iconoclasm on all levels. Even today, you see it sometimes in some places in the world. People just deliberately destroying art because it's not the right type of art.
Yeah.
There's a few things that are more sickening to me. I mean, obviously, misery amongst actual people is worse. But beyond that, seeing art being destroyed because of a religious dogma just does seem really, really sickening to me.
Well, that's another reason I don't think Anglicanism is directly applied to Protestantism, because a lot of Protestants were Puritans, and a lot of it, like I said earlier, was a reaction to Rome. But that means that things that were always within the English church were rejected, such as the crucifix, such as images, icons, things that helped people pray. A lot of that was destroyed by the Puritans just as much as Henry VIII destroyed the monasteries. And I think destroying beauty and transcendence and destroying things that help people in their faith is always problematic.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible to see. So if we were to pick up the story from, say, a generation or two after Wycliffe, the events in Germany and the life of Luther travelled to England quite quickly. I mean, within 2 or 3 years, you could find, apparently, in Oxford, which was sort of a den of discontent, you could say, and Cambridge, but you could find printed versions of what Luther had said and things, quite quickly, within, I think, 3 years or so. And so, if you sort of pick up the story there, I think it's fascinating to me, anyway, to see that how the universities were sort of places of incubation for sort of Catholic discontent. All these people, they certainly wouldn't have called themselves Protestants, because that term wasn't even coined for another couple of generations or so. Maybe they would have called themselves sort of early evangelicals or something. But the point is, they weren't being overlooked by the court, and the Oxford and Cambridge didn't have a bishop that overlooked them, as some universities in Europe did. So they were sort of allowed to, from a Catholic point of view, fester, if you like. They're allowed to get away with it on some level for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I mean, I wonder what you think about that. So it ends up breeding people like Thomas More.
Yeah, it always has. And of course, I'm sure we'll get to the other end of that with the more recent, in the 19th century, in the Oxford movement. But they always have festered, and this has always been a petri dish. And I think we probably would have become more Lutheran as a church if he had survived longer, because by the time we'd taken on board some of his messaging, the people who were adopting it were left on their own and isolated, because he'd unfortunately died at the time. So I'm not sure where we would have gone, but that's probably why we diverged and made our own way. But around that time as well, we had, in 1530, we had the Act of Parliament, which essentially said English law, or English people make English law, and Roman law cannot circumvent English law. So this is a direct answer to what we're seeing with the monks, what we're seeing with people who are loyal to Rome, and what we're seeing with the money going back and forth. All of that was cut off, essentially making independence for the English Church for once and for all. And as a result of that, Rome excommunicated our Queen Elizabeth. So many people think that Henry VIII and his divorce situation is what sparked or was the period of Reformation. But actually, later, when Queen Elizabeth I was excommunicated from Rome, that is truly where we became independent. Not Henry VIII, not the Independence Act of Parliament, but when our Queen got excommunicated. So we didn't leave Rome. Rome kicked us out. Rome got rid of us.
Right.
I think that's a minor detail that people often miss out.
I'm very interested in, I think most people are, in Henry VIII, all different aspects of his reign and life and how he thought about the world. Yeah. One of the things I think's very interesting to notice when you read the histories is how sort of capricious he was, how he sort of changed his mind and vacillated a fair bit. And he didn't just break with Rome, just, as you say, he didn't just have a nice clean break at a certain point. Yeah. It was far from that. And in fact, it seems like it was a deliberate policy to keep everyone around him on their toes. Yeah. And people would think, oh, well, this is what the king thinks. This is sort of the king's position on various spiritual matters. And then suddenly, like a year or two after that had effectively been established, suddenly Henry would blow up in a rage about someone who's guilty of heresy suddenly. And no one knew where they stood. And he did that for years and years on end.
I would say they did know where they stood. I would say he was very Catholic and more Catholic than most people at the time. And I think that confuses people, especially when they believe that he is the great reformer. He always made sure that we kept our liturgies, our traditions, and our traditional Catholic faith all the way through. His problem was that he was legalistic, and he wanted to get around this idea that once you're married, that's it. It's indissoluble. And his solution to that was, well, actually, you can't marry your brother's ex-wife because your brother is permanent. Your brother is always married to her, that marriage is indissoluble. So you can't, it's just not possible. Therefore, my marriage to her would not have been valid. So therefore I was never married, so I can get married again. And that is his great downfall. Obviously, women were his downfall, as we famously know. But he's trying to get round the doctrine by being legalistic with it.
I think you're absolutely right fair to say that he was more Catholic than Lutheran, certainly. But there was sort of, I think you can say there were sort of some fundamental breaks. For example, one of the first things that springs to mind, well, not even mentioning the monasteries and the destruction there, but where the story of William Tyndale, for example, and having a Bible written in the vernacular, written in English, for normal people not only can read, but sort of encouraged to. You can find a free English language Bible in your local parish church. Yeah. I mean, Rome, that's true. They'll burn you alive for doing something like that in Barcelona.
And that's true. That's a very important thing to note, because I think that is the fundamental breaking point of when we decided we're heading in a different direction. Because if the church isn't going to do this, the universal church isn't going to make this decision, we will do it ourselves. And giving people access to the Bible is the greatest thing the English church ever did. And of course now all churches do this, and it's common and it's usual. But the Tyndale Bible was the start of that. And of course later the authorized version, known to people outside of England as the King James Version, is the most read book in the world. And I think that is inspired. There's a reason behind that.
Yeah, the only translation I think is, not the only, the best translation is the King James.
It is the best, because it's very literal, but it's very beautiful too. It has a lot of poetry to it, and that helps people. Beauty always helps people in their worship.
Once you sort of get your eye, and when you read something that's a bit difficult to read, something like the Iliad or something, you have to get used to it. You have to get used to the tone and the voice of it. But once you are, I think you're quite right. It's beautiful.
Yeah, there's a reverse snobbery these days. People say, "Oh, it's too difficult for young people to grasp. We've got to move away from the authorized version." It's like, well, no. People have managed to read it for the last 500 years. Are we less able now than we were 100 years ago? Are we more stupid? Of course not. And I think it's again that common denominator of low expectations. It's that soft bigotry of not expecting people to be able to do something, but of course they can if you let them, and they'll get something out of it. It's a great thing. It's a good thing.
I think that idea of sort of getting your ear in, like watching a very, very old film. I rewatched Citizen Kane about a week ago. It's a very slow film, but once you get used to it, I quite like watching old westerns. Again, usually very, very slow. Yeah. But once you're just used to it and just take it for what it is. Then it's great on a whole new level. Yeah. I think it's obviously not that people are more stupid now. I think maybe, though, you could say that their attention spans are shorter. Yeah. And to sit down and read the King James, I expect a 20-year-old these days to sit down and quietly read the King James for quite a long time before they're used to it. And
it's the only version we use in my church. So.
All right.
I think we just have to be more traditional and stick to our guns and not let people try to modernize us, because that way leads to hell.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.